So many people are walking around feeling emotionally lonely and isolated and isolating in their lives, but don't necessarily know that they're so deep in that place of loneliness because it has been their entire story. So they may or may not feel or experience true loneliness in the way we think about it. In other words, the implication is that there's a desire and a longing for other people to be around. Many of us feel the most ourselves when we are completely alone. And outside of different, patterns for our brains and things like that, I will say that, and those can layer together, if you had a childhood that lacked real emotional intimacy, it often creates a life for you where, for many different reasons, the story of your nervous system is that I'm really most familiar and at home when I'm alone. And yet there might be parts of your life while you really enjoy being alone that you would like to add more connection into your life, but you don't really know how. So let's talk about the relationship between complex PTSD, loneliness, emotional loneliness, and isolation. Because when we're talking about emotional loneliness, you may have grown up in a house surrounded with people. You may have never even had your own room. There were so many people, or resources were limited, whatever it was, or you chose that. So the idea of loneliness is not something you really connect to, but you do connect to this need to isolate and how it impacts your life. So let's talk about why that happens, what kind of situations in childhood can create emotional loneliness and a lack of emotional intimacy, which then can affect every area of your life, not just whether you isolate or not, but how you show up with people, how you give or receive love physically, emotionally, intimately, how you think you're supposed to be with yourself about loving yourself or showing up for yourself or not. It can be impactful. So let's talk about that, like I'm saying. So we're going to go through a bunch of scenarios where this is often happening. Now, of course, the more this happens, the more the repetitive the pattern is, the more significant the impacts can be. So let's get into what kind of situations in homes in childhoods we often see this in. The first one is that you had no real emotional safety. And what I mean is that no matter how great or not the parents were, they were generally not predictable or consistent. And so at the end of the day, you learned that there's no place for emotional safety. And this is often found in narcissistic parents, immature parents, parents who have mood disorders, who may have different personality disorders, different trauma responses. But at the end of the day, your nervous system could never fully relax because it was an eggshell roller coaster situation. Number two, you never really felt seen or known in childhood by your caregivers for who you really are. Do you like mayonnaise or mustard? Do you have dreams about this thing or that thing? What's your favorite color? What do you enjoy? Who your friends are? Who your teachers were? Where you struggle in school? Things like that. Number three, you were told that you were someone else. So you were labeled and given an identity by the parents. You were the golden child, for example. You were the scapegoat. You're the bad child. You're the loving child. You're the whatever, the achiever. So it wasn't about seeing you for who you are, but about a projection of the parents' desires for who they wanted you to be, and therefore where your value or not, kind of where that occurred in childhood in that role. Number four, you were truly a child that experienced emotional neglect. So there was really just no attempt made to have emotionally connecting conversations, to express feelings, and they might have even been extinguished if they had been shared. But really the emotional connection was just didn't really exist. The next one is that you couldn't tell secrets to your parent in any way. So revealing who you are, who you love, what you do, what your passions are, whatever it is, or things that hurt you. It didn't feel safe because they would not hold the secret. They might shame or minimize you for it, but things that were not even necessarily secrets, but important things to your heart were never discussed or are not allowed. The next one is that you could never challenge your parents' emotions. So there would never be any real reciprocity, right? The parent was always here, you were here, they were right and you were wrong. And there was a clear hierarchy, and it was not safe to say well, I don't like it when you yell at me, or, you're really angry right now and that's upsetting. Could you please not do that? Things like that. It was just not an option. The next one, number 7, is that you could not consistently rely on that parent for emotional or physical or mental safety. So maybe it was maybe it was physical safety that was lacking. But whatever it was, of course, if you don't have physical safety, then you don't have emotional safety. It's all connected. So there was just this consistency around a combination of what it meant to be safe in your mind and your body. Number 8, it was a scarcity type of environment. So there was just not enough food, not enough love, not enough patience, not enough emotions, not enough resources, whatever. Everybody was focused on what they weren't getting enough of. And it may have been that the family really struggled to have enough to provide. It may have been that you lived in a 10,000 square foot house, but the idea was that there was never enough for people and what they needed, one way or the other. Number 9, and this goes along with that there's no real reciprocity. And so, like I kind of said earlier, there's no real give and take. It's a very rigid, controlled environment. In fact, control really is the reason why there's no reciprocity. Number 10, parents could not attune to you. Now, this all makes sense. These all kind of go together. But you didn't feel like they could see you with a twinkle in their eye, like ever. They didn't see you as a gift, as loved. You never felt special. No one felt special, or only certain kids felt special, or certain people. So there wasn't like this, we talk about this idea of like your eyes lighting up when you see your child in some way. And I'm not saying perfectly every time, but there's a delight and a joy in that, and you feel that specialness. So that maybe it was very minimal or didn't exist. Maybe you felt like a burden, actually. Number 11, the parents were too self-absorbed in their lives for any kind of emotional content or reciprocity. So this would be a kind of classic narcissistic family system or they're physically absent, of course, abandonment, being absent, being conditional in terms of your physical appearance with your kids. Maybe it's a low custody situation if your parents were divorced, but whatever it was like the parent was too much in their own world and there wasn't really any space for you mentally, physically, and or emotionally. Number 12, the parents actively invalidated emotions. So they discounted them, they minimized, they mocked, diminished, whatever it was. There was an intentional message around emotions. Maybe it was like, boys don't cry, don't be weak. Stop being a crybaby. You're too sensitive. So there's an intentional language and behavior around emotions. And then the last 2 are that maybe you were actually punished for your feelings. So if you, especially negative feelings, we think of as crying, anger, you weren't allowed to have them and or you were actually punished for having them. You were sent away, sent to your room. You lost things. If you had an appropriate temper tantrum, which kids do, appropriate meaning for childhood, sometimes we lose it. There wasn't an attempt to understand emotionally why. It was just really punished. And the attempt was to just extinguish any expression of emotions through punishment. And lastly, you may have been isolated. And so whether it was like you spent hours and hours alone, the parents were at work, the parents were absent, the parents were in addiction, whatever it was, there was a lot of isolation. And so you were left to your own devices around emotions. And because it was, so much to manage, you learn to kind of put them away and never develop the skills of emotional connectivity and intimacy. So what can you do if you're saying, yes, this is a big reason why I isolate. There was sort of this just vacancy in my childhood around emotional connection and intimacy, and I don't know what to do about it. And right now, the only tactic I have is isolation, and I frankly enjoy that, but there are times when I wish I wasn't quite so much that way, perhaps, and it's holding me back, or I'm very much that way and I'd like to change it. The first thing is to just honor the wounded child within, which I know we hear all the time, but sometimes just making space for, if you can't necessarily honor yourself, at least honoring that that what happened to you isn't something you'd want for your own children or your own families, right? It's like you can honor that something happened that was hurtful to you. And sometimes that's easier than connecting to our child selves because it can feel so distant, but honoring that. Number 2, examine where you think your wounds are being reinforced. So where are you creating or reenacting your trauma? So for example, if you kind of want to do things, but your social anxiety or your tendency to isolate is interfering with your ability to do some things, then even though it feels safer to do those things, at the end of the day, you're reinforcing them. And so looking at those patterns And of course, looking at where you might seek help and support for working on those issues. Number 3, understanding that your nervous system has these patterns and roles and how that is really affecting the way you show up. So for example, if you had a childhood where there wasn't emotional connection, but there's a lot of like anger and rage or eggshell, unpredictable stuff, and you live in a fight or flight dynamic. And so the way that you deal with that fight or flight is that you, at every chance you get, your nervous system is so activated around people and work and everything else in the world that you actually prefer isolation. You need to understand, though, that what you're doing is, in your isolating, it's not that you don't necessarily want connection. It's just that at this point in your life, that's the only way you know how to feel calm and in your body. And so looking at how to elevate your nervous system, how to reduce your nervous system, and managing like the polyvagal ladder, those types of things is really important. Number 5, make a list of what you enjoy when you're isolating and alone and what you'd like to do different, where you'd like more connection. So it's not a blanket statement of like, oh, you can't ever, it's bad to do these things. I actually think isolation can be a lifesaver for so many people, for their own healing, for their own nervous systems. It's just when it crosses into a place where you feel lonely or you want more connection, only you can decide what is right for you. But we know that there's a place where connection is actually really healing. So, but look at where are you okay with it, and where would you like to challenge yourself to grow some more and make some changes. Number 6, I do believe this more than anything, is that we can talk about these things all day long, but you have to do something. You have to, okay, I'm going to go take a cooking class by myself at the Sur La Table or whatever. I'm going to book a vacation alone. I'm going to just go to the neighborhood party by myself, even though it's really scary. Or I'm going to make a phone call by myself, and that feels like I'm reaching out for connection. I'm going to make a lunch date with somebody. So you have to do things. There's only so far you can go with thinking and processing, where you have to, I talk a lot about in my reparenting course, setting up your life as if you do matter. It is about doing things, boundaries, self-care, things like that. All of that, from your exercise, your physical health, your mental health, you have to do things. And many of us, especially if there's like a wasteland of emotional connection and intimacy, you've just stuffed all the parts of yourself that make you you, and you've kind of like the parent, minimized them, shamed them, judged them, neglected them, and you don't necessarily know even how to where to begin, what to do. But you've got to do something. So take actionable steps, even if they're baby steps. The next one is to explore what is the narrative of that child. So oftentimes there's a core belief and a core wound. So there's no space for my emotions. Nobody wants to hear my feelings. My feelings don't matter. My feelings are dangerous. My feelings deserve punishment. I'm bad for having feelings. Those kinds of narratives. And to do the work, whether it's through reading books on inner child work and reparenting, which is the next big one, to do that kind of work, and that, like I said, goes back to not just how you think about yourself and how you talk to yourself, but how you show up for yourself in your life. And so look at that narrative and start to challenge it a little bit. Even though that may have been absolutely a true narrative for your childhood, it doesn't mean it has to be the narrative of your adult life, or you have to stay in that narrative. There are places to modify it and potentially shape it into a place where it feels much better for you. And lastly, do work on honoring and looking at your emotions. How do you communicate them to yourself? How do you accept them or not? How do you express them? Like, the work of emotions is such a big thing if you did not have emotional safety in childhood and connectivity and intimacy, and you actually had loneliness, that it feels like overwhelming to even think about how you might share your feelings to someone you care about. I think for certain populations, certain cultures, even talking about feelings is even, it's just like, it's a taboo. You're not supposed to talk about that. You can talk about your body or your health issues or about sports or whatever it is, but there hasn't been a real encouragement in different people's lives about how to really talk about emotions and how to share them, how to feel them, how to not shame them in yourself. So those are the things I think are most helpful in healing that emotional loneliness, especially if it relates to Cptsd. And if or not, I should say, because you don't necessarily need to have isolation in this, but I think oftentimes we felt so isolated in our emotions because of that lack of intimacy and connectivity, that it is the first place we go in our adult lives. The last thing I'll say is that because of what happened in the last few years, for those of us who already had these issues and tendencies, it's made it stronger So it's made our tolerance, our social batteries for many of us. We feel safer alone. And I think for many people, that's been a good thing to realize, oh, I was actually living in a very stressed, extremely strenuous social dynamic, and I don't want that. I want to have more balance. For others, it's gone so far that way, we're not sure how to go back in. Our bodies don't feel like they can tolerate that same connection anymore. So just honoring, only you know where you are in that work, but there can be many factors, not just your childhood, but also what's happened in your daily life with your job, your partners, your stories, all of those things, your family for sure. And I guess I would just add this, I didn't have it written down, but if this is still your family dynamic, if you're still expected to show up and go back in that family at the holidays or every week or Sunday dinner in that emotionless dynamic, something is going to have to give, because as you do this work, it's going to make it more difficult to tolerate. So maybe it's setting new boundaries, maybe it's trying to create some kind of connection or healing with these parents or family members or friends, but just understand that when you shift, it really is like a domino effect. It starts to shift the whole system. And like I'm saying, that can be a good thing and a difficult thing. So, and those can both be worthy, right? Difficult isn't always bad. Sometimes difficult is the source of growth, but just keep that in mind. So thank you for being here. Please stay safe and well and take good care of your inner child. And I will see you tomorrow. Bye.